Hello, St. Matthew's United Methodist Church and the rest of our community joining us online. I'm Pastor Kelly.
And I'm Pastor Dave.
And it's great to have you with us. On this week's episode, we're talking more about Charlton Heston. No, I purposely did not put Charlton Heston in our notes, but somehow he will come up. We're still working our way through Exodus, and it's been a blast. Dave preached a great sermon on Sunday around the Hebrew people and freedom, because there's something that happened this week that we in the United States of America observe. What is it? It's like Eagles and barbecues and Hulk Hogan, right?
And firecrackers, yeah.
Firecrackers.
Yeah,
not in our city. We're not allowed. Still heard them, though.
Yeah, July 4th.
July 4th.
We're actually recording this on July 5th, so we've just experienced all of that.
My favorite holidays are May the 4th and Revenge of the 5th. Anyway, so Dave, without getting too far in the weeds, you want to take us through a little bit. You did Exodus 12, 14 through 20.
It's Exodus 12. That's right.
He asked me this morning, he was like, this isn't right. And I was like, this was last week's, right? And then David said I was right.
That is correct.
See, now it's on camera. Now it's on film. But anyway, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, you're going to invite Jesus into
that's right.
into the room? Yeah? Okay. So now we can start.
I'm thinking about all the sounds I want to use for that now. Anyway.
All right. So Exodus 12 is where the Exodus happens. Or where it begins to around the beginning of it. So the Exodus is the name of the book, and then it's also the event of the Hebrew people leaving Egypt. Mm-hmm. So in Exodus 12, we're at the point where it's the night before the people are going to walk out of the city.
Yep.
And they're getting prepared for with the Passover meal and with all of that, they're getting ready for that. Mm-hmm. Throughout the point I made in the message yesterday, or one of them, is that throughout this experience of Moses going to Pharaoh and working out, the how the people would leave and Pharaoh saying no, and then finally changing his mind. Whenever Moses would go to Pharaoh, he would tell Pharaoh, my people need to leave. They need to go out into the wilderness so that they can worship, so that they can sacrifice, they can begin this. And really what he is saying is so that they can begin this relationship with God. Mm-hmm. Up to this point, God is always spoken of as the God of Abraham and God of Isaac. So God of the ancestors and Jacob. God of our ancestors, but this is the point where that kind of changes. Mm-hmm. It's no longer a God who was with our ancestors, but it's a God who is with us.
Right.
So that's the shift that's about to happen. It's a very important shift and very kind of earth-shaking kind of shift.
Yeah.
That's happening here. That's going forward into the not only going into the wilderness, but going into this process of developing the relationship that we kind of take for granted today and that we enjoy today. But that's why this is so foundational for the Jewish people and really important for Christians as well. Mm-hmm. So in this movement to be free to worship, in the message I drew a connection to our own history in Methodism. Mm-hmm. So Methodism began by really a guy by the name of John Wesley, for those of you non-Methodist who are listening to us. So John Wesley lived in England. He was a priest in the Church of England at the time. Never meant for Methodism to be separate from the Church of England. It was always a revival movement within the Church of England. Wesley thought that they had lost the spirituality, had lost, the practice of religion had become stale. Mm-hmm. Maybe we can relate to that today, maybe not. But so this was always meant to be a movement within the Church of England. Mm-hmm. It began, of course, in England, spread, of course, the early American, migration was happening. to America. Those followers who were listening to John Wesley and Methodism came as well. Were some of the early settlers to America, and were supported, continued to be supported, continued to be a part of the Church of England at the time. So they still depended on the Church of England for the sacraments and for baptisms and for communion. Those things still was a very tight connection.
Yes.
So we fast forward to the Revolution, July 4th, all of those kind of things. No spoiler here, but England lost the war. And so since the Church of England was bound to the throne, to the king, and to the country lost. They withdrew all of the priests who were supporting the Church of England at the time, which left these people who were Methodists, who followers of Wesley and in this working in this faith, left them kind of in a hard position where they had trouble worshiping. Their means of worship had been taken away. So this is the similarity to the Hebrew people. Wesley, to account for that, said, well, I can't leave them hanging. So he in the Christmas conference of 1784, began to ordain bishops who would start something new outside of the Church of England at this point. It's famous within Methodist circles that the first two bishops were Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury. So in case you're into name dropping, there you go.
If you ever heard of Cokesbury, it's because they took both those names and just smushed them together.
That's right. But anyway, so that was kind of the foundation of Methodism that was apart from the Church of England, and the way that we were able to continue to worship in this country separate from the Church of England.
Yeah, love it. So I love talking about Wesley because first off, I've come to two conclusions. I think Wesley was a wonderfully complicated person, like most people are. And two, I really don't think he was a lot of fun at parties. I really think he was that guy. You're like, I don't.
He was straight up.
He was
he was hard edged. Yes.
And final point, and then we're gonna move through this. Is Wesley was an English sympathizer and thought that we should stay subjugated to England. But we're not going to do that because we won. So, that's a really neat part of Wesley and Methodist history. But anyway, so I love the context here. I think that there's so much there, right? As far as it's why context is important, right? Because if we just read a story and we get to the end and we're like, oh, it worked out for them and everything was great, as opposed to the God of our forefathers or our ancestors, right? The Hebrew people at this point are subjugated and enslaved by the Egyptians for, 400 years. It's like multiple generations of people have not worshiped God freely or in the ways that their ancestors did. They've just been enslaved in Egypt. And then you, like, the connecting point you're making, right? And so this is like it's not even just that they're getting set free so they can go do the thing that God wants them to do. We know, like, if you read further, they're on the banks of the Red Sea and it's still not going well. And
that's next week.
Oh, sorry. That's next week.
Don't spoil it.
So, but it's not just, okay, let them go. And then they get to go worship and everything's peachy keen and great. There's a transitional period here, and then connecting it to, the United States of America and the independence from England, there's hurt and there's pain and there's grief and there's a fear here where the structure and the thing that existed before has been torn away. It's gone. It's done. And it's not like, oh, we built it slowly so we can transition. It's just a tear. And so everybody's kind of left with this, okay, what do we do now? We got freedom, great. Now what? And not that they were like, great, now what? But I think that there's a thing we can all relate to even more recently. Because the question I wrote was, what happens when the way you know how to worship is taken away and or changed, or there's obstacles? And I'm like, there hasn't been anything recently in the last couple of years that's happened where we had to change things, right? Oh yeah, COVID. So I just want us to kind of dive into that question. So what happens when the way you know how to worship is different, changed, taken away, obstacles or whatever?
Well, whenever there's a big change like that, the first thing you're dealing with is grief. I mean, that's always part of it, part of that change. In COVID, we could no longer come together physically,
Right.
And we were forced. I mean, to do that. That wasn't anybody's kind of conscious decision or desire.
Right.
The circumstances changed, and we had to adapt.
Right.
So here at St. Matthew's, we bought cameras. We we figured out how to stream onto the internet, and we're able to do that. We still, as we could, we would meet. We had several worship services that were outdoors, so that we could come together. As we began to understand more about our limits and what we could do.
Right.
So we started doing that. But so that grief is part of any change, and it was part of the change. We see it in Exodus, the grief. As we continue, we go into next week and into the further journey. After the people have left Egypt, they begin to yearn for the past and for what it was like in Egypt, and in our Methodist kind of struggle, I'm sure there was grief there too. I mean, not being part of the Church of England. And that system that they were used to, there was some grief and ways that they had to adapt that were different from what they were in the past.
Yeah.
And so there's always that grief piece. But going forward, I think in neither of these instances that people just stop or say no more.
Right.
You figure out how to do it in the new way,
Right.
And how to live with the difference. Past from present,
No, it's great.
and if you focus on God, and that relationship with God, I mean, that's really what worship is about. And you're yearning. I think within us, it's not that we're yearning for a style of worship or a place of worship or anything. We're yearning for that relationship between God and the community that we're a part of to continue.
Right. Right. Yeah. Well put. Okay. See you next week. Well, I think I'm trying to think of what thread I want to pull on. That's not going to keep us here for an hour and a half.
I got time.
I'm hungry. No, but and there's, as I'm sitting here thinking about what you're saying, and having watched the sermon and been in worship and participated in thinking about the overlaps between the Exodus and the Hebrew people and what they're struggling through, our historical as citizens of this country, but also as Methodists, and then even now, like COVID and just these kind of how these shifts happen. And I think sometimes in life, right, like those shifts are abrupt. Sometimes they're not as abrupt. Sometimes they're really painful transitions. Sometimes they're wanted transitions. And so there's this, I think, this consistent thing in our lives, that there's this movement that consistently is happening, right? And there's change. And it's scary. I think sometimes there's a, God is like, hey, I'm going to do a new thing. And we're like, but the old thing's great. Like, this works. And God's like, yeah, not so much. I want it to be. And I want to say this clearly too. And I want us to move into the next question is, I think one of the things that's really important, as even our denomination, I'm not getting into it, is going through a transitional time and a change time, is in an attempt to not grieve, right? I think sometimes there is things we do where we will overgeneralize or oversimplify something to help with that process. So we'll say maybe something to the effect of, oh, it was all bad, or it was all good, or when we were doing it this way before, we misheard, or you misheard, and God didn't want us to do that anyway. So we're trying to move into the thing that God actually wants, as opposed to maybe it's a little bit more fluid than that. Maybe God had never left the Hebrew people. It was just a different time, and God wanted to call them into something else, but wasn't ashamed or disappointed or angry about this thing before. And so, to your point about grief and process, as we're answering the question of how do you move through it and to the next thing is, that's a part of that process. It's hard. It can be really sad and difficult, and it can also be liberating. We'll get into freedom in a minute. But understand that you have to process through it. And I think that's part of where, and we'll get into it next week, of the journey. But that's also sometimes why I think, when God calls us into the new thing or a different thing, I think that's why we don't just arrive at the new thing right away. At least in my life, I have to process, and the journey allows me to process. Because it was just jump from this into this, I'd be like, cool, and I wouldn't learn anything ever. So sometimes there's that.
Yeah, and nothing is never instantaneous.
Yes.
We might look back, at some time, and the transition time may have been several years, but 100 years from now, it may look instantaneous.
Yeah.
and it's never that.
Well, yes.
And
yes.
so it's we have to realize that there's always that transition piece that's happening.
Yeah, it's the blessing and the curse, right, of being the recipient of the history and the information, and not the person going through it.
Yeah.
Because I can be like, oh, I'm reading this page, and oh, God called them out. Great. And on the next page, it's like, oh, and then they arrived at this spot. I'm like, oh, but there's all of these things that they were encountering and experiencing and going through between these things, between these 2 points. And it's, again, when we're, when those things change or things happen that push you into places that maybe you don't want to be, or they're abrupt or they're hard or whatever, that's part of the process. Got to process. Okay. Second question. You ready?
Okay, I'm ready. Shoot.
Oh, this is the loaded one. Is what is freedom and the believer context? How do we define that?
Yeah. So freedom in the Exodus story, the Hebrew people were slaves. So there was one aspect of it is they were being freed from slavery.
Yep.
And then the second part of it is they're able now to go into the wilderness to begin this relationship, to sacrifice and to practice the worship of God in the way that they wanted to.
Right.
So they're free from slavery. They're freed to worship, which is, part of this freedom thing is that, you've been working in a system all along, and you've been freed from that system. Now it's kind of all on you. What are you going to do? How are you going to, if you don't have the tradition or the history or the whatever boundaries you had before, you're working in a new set of conditions. And maybe there's new boundaries in this new set.
Mm-hmm. Like the wilderness.
Like the wilderness. But then you're asking yourself, okay, well, now what? How are we going to do this? I'm free to worship. What's that worship look like? And how is it going to, what do I need to be in that relationship with God? What does God need for me to be in that relationship? So the story of Exodus is a story about freedom from, and it's a story about freedom to become the people of God. And so there was, there's more of that grieving transitional process that's happening there, that the weight then settles on the people. And in a similar way, to the Methodism example. So they're not using the Church of England. They're not bound to the Church of England anymore. How will they structure the church? How will these new bishops come in and lead and allow us to continue to worship. How does that look the same? How does it look different? All of those things are in place. So it's this transition of freedom from and freedom to bears some weight and some responsibility with it, that I think then makes the worshiper focus on the relationship. I mean, I think if you're doing it right, you're focusing on the relationship and how does this continue to grow and continue to be a valid relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things that's always really interesting to how I feel like my brain works is when I say like I'm always thinking about problems, because problems I think always inform process and process then informs solutions. Doesn't mean that I do solve problems or fix anything. I think I kind of just whatever. But so when we're trying to answer this question of like what does freedom help us accomplish? What does it mean in the believer context? And I think what's we're highlighting this part of Exodus because this is the series we're in and being people of God and this type of thing, but also these kind of earth-shattering and spiritually shattering concepts that God is relaying through Moses and Aaron to the Hebrew people of I'm with you, I'm with you, I'm with you. And everybody's been like, where you been for 400 years and all that stuff. And then the Methodist example, and even with COVID and how all these things have just changed and been different. And so for me, like part of the way that you try to figure this stuff out, or what I think people try to do, what we naturally try to do is, what is the need? What is the actual need? And for me, the way I define that is, well, I need to be with God. I'm at my most fulfilled and understand purpose and like all the good, the joy, the peace, the love is like when I'm with God, right? And so I'm thinking some of the questions people are trying to answer here is like, well, how can I be with God? And there's two answers that come out of this. One is God's like, I'm already with you. And I'm like, well, crud. Now what do I get to do? And God's like, just be with me. And I'm like, but what do I have to do? And God's like, be with. Okay. So God's like, hey, I want to be with you. And I am with you. I'm like, okay, what do I do? And God's like, be with me. And then two, what is the consequence of that, right? What is the consequence of what it means to be with God? And we're not going to get into it today. But what we'll see later is, oh, that was not what it meant to be with God. And this is what it looked like to be with God. And I think at times, right, where the line for me always is, where freedom gets confused, it's freedom to be with, and it's freedom to love, right, is when we start building things. I liken it to God's like, hey, I want to be with you. And I go, okay, God, cool. I want you to hang out right there. And then I'm going to go do this thing over here. And I'm going to come back and make sure you're cool with it. And God's like, no, let me be with. And so the distinction I'm making here, and I'm not going to really flesh this out too much, but is where I see that process where God comes in and kind of goes, oh, this is great. And here are the things that I want to kind of like destroy so we can build something different is, see, it's not all bad, but through process and journeying, it's like, oh, this is more like what I want us to be. This is more what I want the relationship to look like. And so for me, it's that the hardest part with freedom is that responsibility of, but I'm just supposed to be with God. And I don't know how to sit still or just be with. I'm a person who wants to go do and like, and I think it's always in the context of what God's trying to do is it's not that I can't go do. It's from the place of being with God and doing with God. And that's where freedom, I think, is in its best spot.
Well, and let me complicate it a little bit. When we worship within a community. And so it's not just, me and God on the golf course or out in nature. I mean, that's wonderful. You can connect with God in that way. But we are called to be part of a community and a worshiping community at that. And that's, God wasn't picking one person in Egypt and saying, I'm going to free you to go, worship me. he was pulling the community out,
Yep.
and the whole people. So it makes things more complicated when it's not just you and God, but it's me and God and all of these people that are surrounding me who have different views and different ideas. And how do we make this journey together?
Yep.
And how do we continue to make God be, the focus of our relationship, and somehow enrich the relationship that we have with each other in the process? So that's really a different question, and especially if we're talking about worship, we're really talking about a community of followers, a community of faith. And that's what I see in the Exodus a lot, and really in the Methodism example as well. It was the backbone of the COVID thing. We really, we could still kind of connect with God in our own practices, spiritual practices that we have, but we couldn't be part of that community. And that's really was the sore spot in COVID, is we couldn't see our brothers and sisters. We could connect virtually, and for some who connect or used to connecting in that way, that's one thing. But for those who were forced into this situation all at once without any kind of primer or advanced warning, it was really difficult. But that communal aspect of it has got to be part of the equation.
Well, and I think to tie that together, right, is culturally, I think we have and I'm not trying to like call out everybody, but I will. So what I would consider an evil or a negative context is we have this very high thing on individualism. And I'm not saying that people can't exist individually and that there isn't good and those things can't also exist. But when we're talking, I think, in the context of freedom of worship and freedom to be with God, I say that from the context of not as an individual. It is in a connected way. And so for us and that doesn't mean that God doesn't exist somewhere where you can experience God solo. That's not what this means. But to fully journey that out, you're doing it with, right? And so I'm not going to pull on the threads of like, we talked about the Trinity and we talked about God also exists in, in community. And that's part of the example and the thing. So when I said I want to be with God, that's colored by the context of I also need to be with other people too. And it's hard because at times I think, and this moves us into our next kind of question here, is sometimes this gets really complex and complicated because when you're doing things with other people, sometimes it doesn't go, and we're not going to talk about now. We'll talk about Methodism and how the Church of England was doing a bunch of things that Wesley was like, that's really problematic and that's not okay. And maybe we should do this instead. And then he's over here and then the war happens and Church of England leaves and everybody's like, what do we do now? And question 3.
Okay.
How do we live this freedom out in modern day contexts?
So we are free. We have our, so we can compare, the United States to cultures where there's not freedom of religion. And in those places, we know that worship still happens, although it's undercover. There's still people who can gather together, under threat of whatever the threat is for them. But that worship can still happen, and people with a life of faith will continue to seek that out, even when there's danger involved.
There's systematic consequences and institutional consequences and things that are set up where the systems in those places they create different hurdles or obstacles for people to live that freedom out. Sure.
So, so as we are free to worship, I think we have to focus on the communal aspect of that. Being free to worship, free to love, free to be in a relationship with God. How are we going to spend that? How are we going to use that freedom? Are we going to use it to kind of build up this little silo that is just me and God?
Uh-huh.
Or are we going to try to work within the community and all of its wonderful complexity? Are we going to try to work within this community to be a community of faith, worshiping God and doing the hard things of life that we're called to do together? So we are free to worship. We are free to be together. We are free to do all of these things within our society, and that puts responsibility on us. It's not just go do our own thing. It's how do we be this community together?
Well, one of the things that, let me sound like a millennial for a sec. So, I love reading through, the jokes of the over assumptions of the different age groups, because some of those things are accurate-ish and sometimes they're really not. But let me be the accurate, targeted millennial for a sec. One of the things that I feel like I grew up with, and not just in a spiritual context, but in a cultural context, was that I should just be grateful without any kind of other context. So it was a lot of like you should be thankful because when I was this is how this was. And I'm like, well, but I'm not in that context. That's not how it is. Like, I don't understand. Like, I don't need to feel bad or like I'm not ungrateful. It's just a different kind of context. And I think what's always created difficulty for me around that is, there's always a couple options for me with that, right? It was either I could press in and just take it as like, I should just be thankful, without any kind of purpose or intention, just, whatever, like this is what it is. I could be more intentional about like, why was that a thing? Where did that come from? Why do I enjoy the freedoms and the benefits I have, and what are they? Or like, just push it back and just be like, oh, you're just being mean and all these other things. And I think part of why I always love our conversations, and I hope you listeners do too, is I think we always try to do a really intentional job of informing context of like what's happening and kind of where there's some overlap maybe, or because things are always in unique or different places. It's never like you can just pull it from Exodus or at the inception of our country and go, oh, these things all directly, like if we just did them this way, it would be, this is what would happen now. Right. It's like, no. They're just different contexts. And so when we talk about freedom and living it out in modern day, right? Like I'm not living in a system where like I can't talk about Jesus,
right? Or
there would be serious consequences to me and or my family, right? And so it's like, oh, I can understand this context and I can empathize or be sympathetic and pray and try to support people who are having to navigate those difficulties. But when I think about like where I'm at, it's like, oh, I can have a vocational job as a pastor, right? Oh, so continuing this on, because I was going to go there, but I want you to go there first because Dave's the sacrificial lamb. Where do you see freedom in our modern context being problematic?
Yeah, it's whenever we hold up individual and to the harm of the community. If we do have these freedoms, but if we use those freedoms to build ourselves up and ignore the communities that surrounds us, I see that as very problematic. If I put individual needs, wants, desires first without considering my brother and sister, I see that to be, frankly, contrary to the gospel. And so that's where that freedom gets, maybe we can say it gets misspent. If it's used to benefit me and not all of us together.
You answered that way faster than I anticipated. So let me make it longer. So where I see a direct kind of correlation, and no, we're not in ancient Egypt. Okay. However, that's the backdrop, is you have a system and people that are using their resource and their privilege and their freedom and their power for self-serving nefarious purposes that have serious historic, permanent consequences to another group of people. That is not a good or a godly use of the freedom that I think God has called us into, where we would oppress and harm and target and do harm to people. Now, but Kelly, that sounds very extreme. What if I live my life in a way where like I'm not causing those levels of systemic or institutional or whatever you want to call it harm? Great question. Am I a person who uses my personal freedoms to not be in community with other people? Do I harbor things in my life and in my person where I think terribly about other people? Or am I motivated by things that are not love and kindness and the things of God? Or am I motivated by things of like, I got to get you before you get me? Do I hoard? Do I look internally for my own benefit at the cost of other people? Well, what do you mean? Well, I'm not saying that I've got kids. I absolutely am very interested in being the best version of myself and taking care of myself so I can also take care of them and taking care of them. 100%. Where there's an overlap here, or a better example, I think, is am I willing to sacrifice other children for the benefit of my own?
Mm-hmm.
That's where there's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
This is where in like our context and I see problems where it's like, oh, am I willing to sacrifice you, your well-being, or your like whatever, insert, not talking political terms, insert here, where I would benefit at your cost.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where like, I think modern day, I'm not going to go into it, but you can read the writing on the wall here is as gospel or as believer centric or centered people. This is where I think there's difficulty where it's like, okay, where does this other thing kind of combine and where are they independent? Where are they not connected? And for me, it's always, if I'm going to be a believer and I have attributed and believe my freedom comes directly from the Creator to be with the Creator and be in the community and to use that freedom to benefit as a beneficiary of having a relationship with God and understanding that and being loved and then loving other people and being loved by other people in a community, what does that look like lived out in our context? And what I'm getting at is not selfish, not harmful, very trying to be self-aware and aware of like, oh, how does this affect not just me, but other people? And so freedom is not self-serving, self-centric. Freedom is the ability and the capacity to go, okay, who also benefits from this? And where I see it being problematic is when freedom is used for the exact opposite of, ooh, who can I exploit? Who can I harm? Or I got to make sure I get mine. You ever been in a room with 4-year-olds and there's one toy train? That's not freedom. Like, so I think that makes some sense, right? Like, I think I've kind of connected those in a way that's flirted with the line, but not like totally, hopefully jumped into the other spot. But I mean that like, as the believer, we're free to be loved and to love. But that freedom as I think it's intended to be in the freedom of the relationship with God and with one another that's how it's utilized, but it's not problematic. Where do you see it being positive? Where do in our culture, in our current context, do we see positive expressions of this freedom being lived out?
Any kind of missional kind of output that we have, any kind of missional efforts to where we decide to use our resources, time, talent, money, all of those kind of things to help folks who need help. That's really where I see the benefit of freedom, where we make our choice. We are free to choose when we make that decision to help those who need help.
Yeah.
That's really for me the shining example of freedom, being free to live out that grace that we've received.
Yeah. I think I'm going to be a little bit more specific. No names. In the last, I think, so I've been working at our church now since November. So we had a baby in August of last year. So like everything's in like a time space warp thing where I'm like, oh, that's today. So I haven't been here for too long. I feel like I've been here for a while though. And maybe it's the summer of being with my kid every day. Anyway, but something I've seen happen, not just in our church community context, but even in people I'm connecting with, whether it's through the podcast or groups that I'm a part of or everything else, is I'm seeing this kind of consistent trend where a community that was faithful before I got here, and a pastor and pastors who were here that were faithful of using their freedom to do the best they could to be in relationship and love God well and love each other well and love their external community well. What I'm a beneficiary of is I've been able to come into a culture and a community where people who, whether it was because of COVID, whether it's because of other kind of extenuating circumstances of pain from church, pain from bad theology, pain from other system places, harm, where they couldn't find a connecting point or a community or a place to really plug in and be, I'm finding that people are connecting. And they're getting to do the thing we're talking about where they get to be very aware of the love that God has for them, but also love other people in a communal context, but then be loved by other people in a communal context and like utilize their gifts and their graces and to help other people. And so what's really cool is I kind of got in this front row seat of healing and restoration, and not saying that like we all live in Egypt and people are just getting murdered left and right. But what I mean by that is it's really cool to see people who have been yearning for that type of community and people who have lived that freedom out well. In that context, there's a space for other people to then come alongside and be beneficiaries of that and then live that out too. And, you know, I think for me, it's just exactly what we're supposed to be doing is, you know, it's like, what does it mean to do that? And so that's been really cool. Those are some really positive contexts for me. And in a more, I guess, global sense, not global as in like the globe, but not as directly connected to my person. The internet can be a wonderful place because you connect with people in different places. And one of my favorite things about Methodism is our connectedness. You know, we just had annual conference a couple weeks ago where we met with a bunch of people who are all over the state. I went to a conference a little bit before that where I was connecting with people that are all over the country. And what was really cool was to be connected to other people and see that, oh, you're doing the same thing. And so it's not the overbearing, like negative news that sells where it's like, oh, it's all terrible and bad and everybody hates everybody and it's da 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 da. What I've been seeing is like, actually, there's a lot of people who really love each other and they're trying to do the best they can to love other people well. And there's a lot of really good, positive, holistic things happening. And so I'm really encouraged by that. So, yeah, that was my final thought too.
Okay.
I probably should have clarified. What's your final thought, Dave?
My final thought. Yeah, all of that in Exodus, right? I've had some people saying you're spending a summer in Exodus. How gross! But no, Exodus is a wonderful book of. It has some difficult stuff in it, but it's really a book about how we become, or how the Hebrew people became the people of God. And so it's a journey of growth. It's a journey of transition. And I love the book of Exodus because I love to read about how these people learn to love God and how they learn to come together in a community around that God, and you know, receive all the blessings that come from that. And it's not like it's a you know, rainbows and unicorns kind of story. There's a lot of brokenness. There's a lot of upheaval. There's a lot of all kind of that kind of stuff happening in it, which tells me it's real life. You know, it's easier to connect with real life when it's not just all perfectly, everything falls into order. You know, it's you work through that difficult stuff and that change. And so that's why I love this story of Exodus and the people that are part of it.
Final thought. See, I joke with Dave. I'm never going to do this. No, I am. Watch this because I got a mic. For me, all that is also in the context and just packaging it is the being with. It's this incredible story and journey of people learning to be with God. And I'm like, oh, all the things you're stumbling through, the things I still stumble through. And I'm encouraged by that.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, oh, you hadn't gotten it all figured out yet either. And I'm like, but you're the Hebrew people. You're the chosen people of God. And it's like, oh, we're struggling through the same things. Okay, cool. Like, I'm encouraged by that because it's like, oh, process, journey. Awesome.
Yeah.
That's my final thought.
Okay.
Pastor Kelly.
And I'm Pastor Dave.
And we'll see you next week.